The rattling of the train matched the tremor in her hands. Outside, endless prairie rolled past in waves of golden grass and scorched earth, but she couldn't see any of it, only the dull reflection of her own eyes in the soot-streaked window. Seated near the back of the passenger car, she wore a faded dress that had been mended too many times, a bonnet tugged low to hide the bruise near her cheekbone. She was no stranger to pain. In fact, pain had been the only constant in her life. Since childhood, she'd been passed between hands like a tool, bartered off by her mother for debts, beaten into silence by a succession of men who all believed kindness was weakness. She had no memory of safety, no vocabulary for peace. But now, tucked into the inner lining of her coat, was a letter, creased and smudged, but still legible, a promise inked in hope. A rancher from Wyoming Territory, needing a wife. Not a bride of love, but of necessity. She'd answered the ad with trembling fingers and no expectations. It wasn't salvation she wanted. Just escape. The train shrieked as it pulled into the depot at Bitter Ridge. The town was barely more than a cluster of weathered buildings and a saloon with doors that hung crooked. Dust rose in clouds as the engine hissed to a stop. She stepped onto the platform clutching her single valise, a worn carpetbag with one extra dress, a brush and a small Bible with torn pages. Her boots, scuffed and too tight, sank slightly in the dry soil. Men on the platform glanced at her. Some stared. One muttered something under his breath and laughed. She waited, scanning every face for someone holding a nameplate or looking expectant. No one approached. The sun crawled higher. She waited longer. Heat shimmered off the rooftops. Her chest tightened with the realization that the man she was supposed to marry, the man who wrote of a quiet home and honest work, was not coming. Maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he never intended to come at all. She tried not to let her fear show, but the rising panic clawed at her ribs. Then, from across the street, a figure stepped out of the livery stable. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face, and a dust-covered duster that nearly reached his boots. Tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. His presence cut through the noise like a blade. He didn't speak, just walked slowly toward her with an easy, grounded gait. When he stopped in front of her, he held out a gloved hand and gave a single nod. She blinked. "Are you him?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the horse tied nearby, then turned and walked toward it without looking back. She hesitated, heart pounding. Every instinct told her not to trust any man, especially one who offered no explanation. But something in his quiet manner, his lack of intrusion, felt different. As if he expected nothing from her. As if he was simply offering a way out. She mounted the second horse, unsure whether to feel hope or terror. The ride was long. Miles of open prairie, the sun beating against her bonnet. They passed no houses, no people, just the wind and the creak of saddle leather. He didn't speak once. Occasionally, he'd glance back to make sure she kept up, but otherwise, he rode in silence, his movements purposeful but unhurried. The land grew more rugged as they neared the foothills, and by the time the sun dipped low, they arrived at a small cabin nestled between two rocky bluffs. The wood was aged and sun-bleached, but it stood firm. A corral held 2 horses, a small barn leaned against the wind, and a single column of smoke curled from the stone chimney. He dismounted, tied his horse, and opened the cabin door for her. She stepped inside, expecting squalor, but found a room clean and orderly. A woven rug covered the floor. A fire crackled gently in the hearth. The furniture was handmade and sparse, but solid. No other voices echoed within. No woman's belongings. Just a man's solitude pressed into every corner. He didn't follow her in. Instead, he remained on the porch, rifle across his lap as the stars began to pierce the sky. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the letter still pressed inside her coat. She read it again under the flickering lantern light, now fully understanding. This wasn't the man who wrote it. She stepped outside, the wind tugging at her skirts. He sat unmoving, watching the distant darkness. "You're not him," she said. He looked at her, expression unreadable. Then he shook his head. Her throat tightened. "Then why'd you come for me?" His voice came low and rough, like gravel under boot. "He was no good." She stared. "Do you know him?" He nodded once. Then added, "He had no right to send for anyone. Let alone you." She didn't know what to say. Her arms wrapped around her waist as the night chill crept in. She waited for him to offer more, but he didn't. And oddly, she didn't feel angry. Just adrift. Again. She didn't even know his name. He rose, slowly, and walked to the stable without explanation. She followed, compelled by a thread she didn't understand. Inside the barn, he handed her a wool blanket and a flask of water. "You can sleep inside," he said. "No one'll bother you here." And just like that, he walked back into the shadows. She stood for a long time, clutching the blanket to her chest. That night, she lay on the bed, listening to the wind scrape against the cabin walls, and tried to remember a time when a man offered her something without wanting something in return. She couldn't. He stayed on the porch the entire night, watching. Not guarding against her, but for her. When morning came, she found him already mending the paddock, sleeves rolled, movements calm. She walked outside, still unsure of everything. But when he looked up, just for a moment, something in her loosened. Not trust, not yet. But the first fragile thread of it. Whatever lay ahead, she knew this. Her past had followed her like a shadow. But something in this silent man's eyes told her she didn't have to keep running. And that terrified her more than anything. The days blurred into a rhythm that was foreign to her but strangely comforting. At dawn, she would wake to the smell of fresh firewood and the gentle clatter of tin cups. The cowboy never knocked. He simply left hot coffee near the door each morning before heading out to tend the cattle or chop wood. She drank it in silence, always alone, then swept the floor and tidied the space he'd offered her. There were no expectations, no commands. He gave her space, as if he understood that she was learning to breathe again. Though his words were scarce, his actions were precise. He fixed the loose latch on the barn door after she struggled with it one morning. When she burned her fingers while stoking the stove, he wordlessly handed her a cloth soaked in creek water. Once, when she cried quietly after dropping a pan, startled by the noise that reminded her of past beatings, he didn't ask why. He just sat on the porch until the sobs faded, eyes scanning the horizon, giving her permission to unravel without judgment. She began noticing things about him. The way his hands, calloused and strong, were gentle with animals. The way he never turned his back on the setting sun without tipping his hat, almost like he was thanking the day. She still didn't know his full story, but she began to suspect that silence wasn't weakness in him. It was a shield, forged from his own private pain. Sometimes, in the late hours, she heard him murmur names in his sleep. Regret, maybe. Loss. Their quiet companionship grew like something wild and unspoken. She would sit by the porch in the afternoons, sewing or shelling beans, while he sanded wood or fed the chickens. Words weren't needed. The silence between them was never cold. It was peaceful. Honest. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. One blistering afternoon, the air heavy with dust and sweat, she walked to the edge of the field with a basket of corn. That's when she saw them, 3 men on horseback, riding slow and too sure of themselves. Their eyes were like knives, and their clothes, though dusty, bore no sign of honest work. She dropped the basket and ran toward the barn. The cowboy stepped out before she could say a word, rifle already in hand. He stood in the open yard, tall and unmoving. The lead rider dismounted, his boots kicking up dust as he grinned with rot-stained teeth. "Well now," the man drawled, sweeping his eyes over her. "Ain't you the girl from Missouri? Word is someone's lookin' for you. Says you skipped town. Says you belong to him." She froze. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone here about the man from St. Louis, the one who'd called himself her fiancé but had kept her more like property. He had money, reach, and cruel friends who did his errands. The cowboy said nothing, didn't blink. His rifle stayed steady in his hand. The man took a step closer. You think this place can hide you? There's a price on your head, sweetheart. And we aim to collect. Her stomach lurched. The cabin behind them, her only sanctuary, suddenly felt paper-thin. She waited for the cowboy to speak, to bargain or stall. But instead, he raised the rifle and fired into the dirt an inch from the man's boot. Dust exploded. The rider leapt back. Next shot ain't dirt, the cowboy said, voice like gravel after a storm. Silence cracked through the yard. The second rider spat. Ain't worth it. Let's go. But the lead man lingered, glaring at her. We'll be back, he hissed. She's marked. They rode off in a storm of hooves and threats. Her knees buckled. She sank to the ground, head spinning. He didn't touch her. Just stood guard, eyes fixed on the trail long after the men had vanished. Inside, she sat by the cold hearth, shaking. He entered quietly, placed the rifle near the door, and lit the fire. I thought I'd left it behind, she whispered. He looked at her with that calm, steady gaze. Some things don't let go easy. She nodded, eyes damp. They'll come back. Yes. Her throat tightened. You don't even know me. Why would you risk yourself? He sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. Because you deserve a place where no one owns you. She blinked at him. For a moment, the weight of her past loosened its grip. Then, softer, she asked, You ever loved someone? His face flickered, just briefly. Once. She waited, but he said no more. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt like a hoofbeat. Every gust of wind like a threat. But when she looked out the window, he was there on the porch, rifle across his lap, eyes open to the dark. A silent sentinel. The next day, she insisted on learning to shoot. He didn't argue. Just handed her a worn revolver and led her into the field. She missed the first few shots. By the fifth, she hit the old barrel. By the 10th, her hands stopped shaking. He never praised her, but the way he nodded, firm and quiet, was enough. They worked harder after that. Reinforced the doors. Repaired the barn roof. Dug deeper into the well. She learned to saddle a horse, to snare rabbits, to gut fish. There were no more illusions of being rescued by some man with soft hands and softer lies. If she was going to survive, she would do it with her own blood and sweat. But she wasn't alone anymore. Not truly. Days turned colder. At night, they shared meals and long silences broken only by the wind. One evening, as she placed a stitched patch on his torn shirt, he surprised her by saying, I used to have a daughter. Her needle paused. She was about your age now. She looked up. His face didn't break. But his hands trembled. What happened? She asked. He stared into the fire. She and her mother, they were taken. I was too late. The weight of those few words crushed the room. And suddenly she understood him. Not just his silence, but the distance he kept, the care he showed without ever reaching too close. She reached for his hand, slowly. He let her. And for the first time, neither of them looked away. Snow blanketed the land in silence, erasing trails and softening even the harshest outlines of the hills. The world looked clean under the winter sky, but she knew better. The cold couldn't bury the past, nor could it keep danger from finding its way back. Inside the cabin, she wrapped her hands around a tin mug of coffee, its warmth almost too sharp against fingers reddened from hauling firewood. Across the room, he was oiling his rifle by the fire, his movements precise, as always. Though they spoke more now, there were still hours where they worked together in utter quiet, an intimacy more honest than any she'd ever known. Each day brought a new task. Chopping through frozen earth to repair fence posts, patching the roof after heavy snow, stacking supplies they could ill afford to waste. He taught her how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to move silently through a forest, how to listen, not just with ears but with instinct. She soaked it all in, eager to be more than just a burden. He never treated her like one, but old fears lingered in her bones. Proving herself became a quiet mission. One morning, she found him leaning against the barn door, face pale, hand pressed to his side. Blood had soaked through his shirt. A broken plank had caught him the day before, and he hadn't said a word. She rushed to him, pulled him into the cabin, and set to work cleaning the wound with what little whiskey they had left. He gritted his teeth but said nothing. His silence, once a wall, now felt like trust. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear humming in her chest. Later, he muttered through clenched teeth, "Don't waste kindness on me." She shook her head. "It's not wasted. You taught me how to survive. You gave me peace." His eyes met hers, softer than she'd ever seen them. "No one ever gave you that before? No one ever even tried." The storm rolled in 3 nights later. Heavy snow fell like ash, and the wind howled through the canyons. They stayed close to the fire, the flames flickering against the worn wooden walls. She read aloud from the Bible, her voice quiet, steady. He listened, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting something, or someone, to crash through it. She asked him what haunted him, but he only said, "Some debts can't be repaid. You just live different because of them." That same night they heard it, horses. Not one, not two, several. The sound was unmistakable, muffled by the snow but still sharp enough to trigger a reaction. He rose instantly, grabbing the rifle and tossing her the smaller revolver they kept beneath the floorboards. Her breath caught in her throat. She already knew. The men from before had returned. She peeked out the window and saw 6 riders approaching. They moved with purpose, torches in hand, faces wrapped in scarves against the cold, but their intent was clear. They hadn't come to talk. He spoke low. "Go out the back. Take the creek bed north. Don't stop." "I'm not leaving you," she said. "You have to," he growled. "They want you, not me." "No," she whispered, stepping forward. "They want control. And we're not giving it to them." The look in his eyes said more than words ever could. Pride. Fear. Something deeper, something fragile. He nodded once, then turned to face the door. The fight was brutal. The first shot cracked through the night like lightning. He took down the lead rider in a single clean motion, then ducked behind the water trough as return fire shattered the porch rail. She circled around, heart pounding, moving like he'd taught her. Low, quiet, eyes wide. She spotted one of the men sneaking toward the side window and fired. The shot grazed his shoulder and he screamed, retreating. Gunfire echoed across the valley. Flames licked the side of the barn where a torch had landed. He moved like a ghost between shadows, firing and falling back, covering her as they retreated to the ridge behind the house. Blood stained the snow, some theirs, most not. By the time the last of the riders fled, the cabin was half scorched, and smoke drifted into the gray sky. She found him kneeling by the porch, blood on his sleeve, face pale but eyes sharp. "You're hurt again," she said. He looked up at her, the corner of his mouth twitching into something that might have been a smile. "You shoot better now." She laughed, half a sob. "I had a good teacher. They buried the dead far from the house. She didn't ask who would come looking for them. They both knew more danger might return. But something had changed, she was no longer prey. Neither of them were. They rebuilt together, repaired the charred wood, patched the roof with new shingles. Spring thawed the last of the snow, and wildflowers bloomed near the fence post. She planted a small garden, her fingers working soil that no longer felt like punishment. He built a bench on the porch where they sat each evening, watching the sky turn orange behind the mountains. One evening, as birds called out across the ridge and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the cabin, she turned to him. "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" He didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, "I think we needed to." She nodded. "I used to think love meant possession, chains, promises no one kept. And now," she looked at him, eyes full of quiet strength, "now I know it's showing up. Staying. Holding your ground." He reached out, took her hand gently. And for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch. She leaned into it. No vows were spoken, no declarations made. But something solid and sacred passed between them, a bond forged in fire and snow, sealed with silence and shared survival. Their scars would never vanish, but they no longer defined them. Together, they were more than their past. Together, they were whole.